Think back to May 1974. The world was a different place. Guff Whitlam was in the lodge. Billy, Don't Be a Hero, was on the radio. A title that would feel agonizingly real in just a few hours. It was an era before satellite radar, before 24-hour news cycles, and before we knew that the climate could turn on us in an instant. You had the evening paper, the wireless, and the grey sky above you. If you were standing on Stockton Beach that night, you wouldn't have just heard the wind. You would have felt it in your teeth. You would have seen a 53,000-ton beast, a ship the size of an office block, being tossed around like a bath toy. The MV Sygna was fighting for its life. Inside, 30 men and women were gripping the railings, watching the radar screen turn into a solid wall of green clutter. We often think of vintage Australia as a sun-bleached postcard. Golden beaches, dusty outback, a land of she'll be right. But 1974 wasn't like that. 1974 was the year the postcard was ripped in half. It was the year of the big wet, the year of the inland seas. And it was the year of the Great Storm, a white hurricane that buried the mountains in snow, smashed the coast with hurricane-force winds, and left scars that you can still see rusting in the sand today. This isn't just a story about weather. It's a story of the most violent year in Australian history, and how, on one pitch-black night in May, a group of helicopter pilots had to fly into the mouth of hell to prove that we wouldn't be beaten. To understand the terror of May 1974, you have to understand the deception. It didn't start with a scream. It started with a whisper. The early 70s in Australia felt safe. We were a lucky country riding a mining boom. The cities were growing, the suburbs were sprawling out into the bush, and the average family could afford a house on a quarter-acre block. But meteorologically, something was broken. Since January, the rain hadn't stopped. The continent was soaking wet. In Brisbane, the river had already swallowed the city in January. The ground was saturated. The dams were full. The country was like a sponge that couldn't hold another drop. Then came May. On Friday, May 24th, meteorologists in Sydney noticed a low forming in the Tasman Sea. Now, East Coast lows are common. They're nasty, erratic systems that spin up off the coast, dump some rain, and leave. Usually, they drift away toward New Zealand. But this one was different. It didn't drift away, it stopped. It parked itself right off the coast of Sydney and Newcastle. And then it started to feed. It sucked in moisture from the warm ocean and cold air from the Antarctic South. It intensified rapidly, dropping pressure at a rate that today would have triggered bomb cyclone warnings on every smartphone in the country. But in 1974, there were no smartphones. There was no internet radar. There was just the evening news bulletin, which warned of strong winds and rough seas. People went to bed on Saturday night thinking it would be a wet Sunday, a stay inside and read the paper kind of day. They were wrong. By Sunday morning, the trap had sprung. The pressure dropped to 986 hectopascals. The wind didn't just blow, it accelerated. It hit Sydney at 165 kilometres per hour. That is not a gale. That is a Category 2 cyclone. But unlike a tropical cyclone which hits and moves on, this system was stationary. It was a giant grinding millstone sitting on top of the state's most populated area, refusing to move. And then the temperature plunged. In the Blue Mountains just west of Sydney, the rain turned to ice. This wasn't a dusting, this was a burial. Thick, heavy, wet snow began to fall on towns like Katoomba, Blackheath and Lithgow. It coated the eucalyptus trees, trees that are evolved for drought, not blizzards. Their branches, laden with tons of ice, snapped like gunshots. Power lines came down. The Great Western Highway, the main artery connecting the west to the city, was severed. Thousands of people woke up in dark, freezing houses. They looked out their windows and saw a landscape that looked more like Siberia than New South Wales. They were trapped. No power, no heat, no way out. But while the mountains were freezing, the coast was drowning. On the coast, the ocean had risen up to meet the land. The storm surge combined with the king tides created monsters. Waves were recorded at 17 metres high. That's a 5-story building of water crashing into the beaches every 12 seconds. Manly Wharf was smashed. The swimming enclosure at Balmoral was twisted into scrap metal. In Sydney Harbour, the ferry Lady Trilby was almost capsized by the swell inside the harbour itself. But the real drama was happening 100 miles north, off the industrial city of Newcastle. Anchored just a few miles offshore was the MV Sygna. It was a Norwegian bulk carrier waiting to load coal. It was a masterpiece of modern engineering, 53,000 tons, 218 metres long. It had a crew of 30, including men and women who had sailed the roughest oceans on Earth. The captain, Ingolf Lunde, had received the storm warnings, but he had a choice. He could pull up anchor and steam out to deep sea, riding out the storm in the open ocean. Or he could stay anchored, trusting the massive weight of his ship and the holding power of the seabed. Looking at the conditions, he chose to stay. It was a gamble that he would regret within hours. Around midnight, the wind shifted. It hit the Sygna broadside. The force of the wind on the ship's massive hull was like a giant hand pushing it towards the shore. The engines were fired up, full power ahead. They tried to turn the ship into the wind, to fight the drift. But the propeller was churning mostly air. The waves were so steep that the stern of the ship was being lifted out of the water. The ship was dragging its anchors. Two massive flukes of steel ploughing through the seabed, unable to find a grip. They were drifting at a speed of walking pace, relentlessly, towards Stockton Beach. At 4 a.m, the call went out. Mayday, mayday. But who could answer? No tugboat could survive 17-metre seas. No lifeboat could be launched. It would be smashed against the hull instantly. The crew was trapped on a sinking island of steel. Then, at 5 a.m, a sickening crunch echoed through the hull. The Sygna had hit the bottom. It ground into the sandbank just 130 metres from the shore. But being close to shore didn't mean they were safe. It meant they were in the impact zone. The waves were now breaking over the ship. Thousands of tons of water hammered the deck. The ship began to list. The hull began to hog and sag. It was breaking its back. Captain Lund ordered the crew to the highest point of the ship, the bridge. They huddled there in the dark, 30 souls, feeling the steel beneath their feet groan and crack. They could see the lights of a police car on the beach, just a stone's throw away. But between them was a boiling cauldron of white water that would kill any swimmer in seconds. They need a miracle. And a miracle in 1974 looked like a Bell UH-1 Iroquois helicopter. At RAAF base Williamtown, just north of the crash site, Flight Lieutenant Gary McFarlane got the call. The mission was impossible. Take a helicopter up in hurricane-force winds, fly it into zero visibility, hover over a moving, tilting ship that is being smashed by waves, spray reaching 100 feet in the air, winch 30 people to safety. If the wind caught the rotor blades, he would flip. If the engine ingested too much sea spray, it would flame out. If the ship rolled while the winch was down, it would snag the cable and drag the helicopter into the sea. McFarlane didn't hesitate. Let's go. They took off into the grey. The wind was so strong they had to fly the helicopter sideways just to move forward. The rain was like bullets hitting the windscreen. When they reached the Sygna, the scene was apocalyptic. The ship was rolling 30 degrees to the side. The waves were crashing over the bridge, sending geysers of white foam into the flight path. McFarlane had to hover just metres above the ship's railing. He had no visual references. The horizon was gone. The sky was gone. He had to fly by feel, fighting the controls every second to keep the bird steady, one by one. The winchman was lowered down to the heaving deck. The crew of the Sygna, terrified and soaked, were strapped into the harness. Up they went, swinging in the gale. The wind chill was below freezing. They ferried them to the beach, dropped them into the arms of the waiting police, and turned back. Back into the spray, back to the wreck. They did it 30 times. No brakes, no refueling, just adrenaline and precision flying. The last person off was Captain Lund. As he stepped onto the sand of Stockton Beach, the Sygna gave one final groan. The ship was lost. But every single soul was safe. It remains, to this day, one of the most daring rescues in Australian aviation history, a feat of airmanship that defies physics. While the Sygna crew were drying off in Newcastle Police Station, the rest of the state was digging out. In the Blue Mountains, the blizzard of 74 had left its mark. Locals recount tunnelling out of their front doors. Cars were abandoned on the highway, just humps of white in the landscape. It wasn't just snow, it was a suspension of reality. For 3 days, the modern world stopped. The ticking clock of 9 to 5 was replaced by the ancient rhythm of survival, keeping the fire lit, melting snow for water, checking on the neighbour. The storm of May 1974 eventually dissipated. The snow melted. The Sygna became a local landmark, a rusting giant that children would play near for decades. Australia took a breath. We thought the worst was over. We thought nature had made its point. But 1974 wasn't done with us. 7 months later, Christmas Eve, the other side of the continent, Darwin. While families were unwrapping presents and basting turkeys, a small black dot appeared on the radar screens. It was a cyclone named Tracy. And if the May storm was a hammer, Tracy was an atomic bomb. It would flatten the city of Darwin in 4 hours. It would sound like the screaming of 1,000 banshees. It would destroy 70% of the homes and change the nation forever. From the snows of the Blue Mountains to the flattened ruins of Darwin, 1974 stands alone. It was the year the sky fell. It taught us that for all our modern concrete, our steel ships, and our comfortable suburbs, we are just guests on this continent. And sometimes the landlord comes to collect. If you go to Stockton Beach today, you can still see the bones of the Sygna at low tide, just a rusted shark fin of metal breaking the surf. Most people walk past it without knowing the story. They don't hear the wind. They don't see the helicopter hovering in the spray. But now you do. This channel is about uncovering those stories, the gritty, raw, vintage history of Australia that they don't teach you in school. If you remember the year the sky fell, hit that like button. And if you want to see more of Australia's forgotten history uncovered, make sure to subscribe.